to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world.
All right. Welcome, everybody, back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this particular episode, I'm just really, really happy to having you back, Carolyn Baker. I call you one of my best old time meaning a few years ago, creative buddy when we were doing online symposia or
Right.
summits, kind of before they were a thing,
That's right.
about collapse and based nearly entirely on your body of work, which even then it was quite a few books. And the thing that really endeared you to me straight away was your ongoing commitment to relatedness, and how that a core that was, no matter what is coming in the future, and no matter what the timing is, relationship and relatedness. And so, thank you for your work, and thank you for all the years that you've been so far out ahead of this conversation. And now, of course, it meaning the study of and the expression of human-caused collapse of both Earth and human systems. Now it has just joined what I call the 24/7 fire hose to the face of too much content about everything,
Yeah.
but especially doom scrolling. And, you and I both know it's just also coming at us at a rate and intensity that people aren't built for. And so it's really hard to look back and see that those were actually the good old days of being able to discern particular sources of information and having far less to have to desaturate from the intensity of the controlled narrative, plus the just fire hose quantity of it all. So you have this long history of, and many, many books that you've written, both alone and a number of them with Andrew Harvey. And I will, of course, include the a way to contact you, your website, your long reading list. Um, and today I'm particularly happy that we're able to speak together because I've got a few threads that I've been preparing for this year-long course that we're now 5 months into, or nearly at the halfway point of this 13-month program. And every month, in order to just have a tiny sliver of doom scrolling, just, it's something that makes it over the threshold of, hey, this is some important stuff about this one particular part of what can be called the polycrisis. So I've got a few, one piece, maybe two pieces per month for people to be able to just selectively take in. And that reminds me of your curation of the Daily News Digest for years now.
15.
Sorry,
15.
15 years. Thank you. And really, thank you. And so in kind of in the slipstream of that, that's why I put together this part of the 13-month curriculum called What We Are Up Against. So each month there'll be a What We Are Up Against episode or segment. And one that is coming soon, that is this conversation is a part of, is preparing for a conversation about preparing for actually the realization of what turns out to be roughly a 45-year or so plan that has been in place by Christian nationalists to create an environment in which they manipulate and control to their satisfaction, to match their agenda, the national narrative, and all the way down to policy making at every level of government. And I'll be peppering in little segments from a couple of, I think, quite telling YouTube videos. One of them will be from Kevin Roberts, who's the spear point person for creating the Project 2025 Republican agenda. So I'll have little excerpts from him and little excerpts from a man named Frank Schaefer along the way. And, this is all in post-production, so I won't bother you with it today.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, let me tell you.
Yeah, yeah. So again, thank you so much. All right, so here's a quick jump start of an inclusion of the occasional clip from people who really have something to say about the Christian nationalist movement and its historical context, as much as the very large scale current context for how are these people, evangelicals and folks who may or may not call themselves a Christian nationalist movement, how they are in every level of our governments, from obviously the national and presidential, all the way down to as local as it gets. And here are some words to kind of give you a sense of the context of their long game plan that they've been in since the 80s, if not quite a bit before that. And then we'll get back to Carolyn and her setting context, for instance, out of her long-standing book about Christian nationalism as well. So let's hear from Kevin Roberts, the point man in the creation of Project 2025.
Was the scale at which we did this particular mandate for leadership, which is what we call this project typically. And that new component was twofold. First of all, we had 110 conservative organizations join us in this because we were trying to end the fractiousness on the American right so that we would be better prepared to govern. But the second thing is, rather than just do the typical resume bank with a few hundred resumes, we decided we would build a personnel database, not just for this election cycle, and for that matter, not just for federal jobs, but hopefully for state and local government jobs. We were hoping to have 10,000 people apply. Obviously, whoever would win the presidency would make the determination. That's up to him or her. But instead, we had 20,000 submit their names. Why? Because the left gave us about $1 billion of earned media that we weren't expecting, we weren't asking for. They succeeded in demonizing the phrase Project 2025, but they also succeeded in motivating many Americans to say, if the left is mischaracterizing that so much, then I want to be part of whatever that is. And what that is taking back our government to revitalize the American dream.
So one of those names was Russell Vogt, who I think it was announced yesterday is going to be in charge of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, as part of the new Trump administration. This was the actual agency that he was writing about in his section of Project 2025, which he was one of the authors of, talking about how it can be used to deliver much more radical change. So in some very direct senses, Project 2025 is happening, no matter what anyone says.
Yeah, and that's because great ideas and great people rise to the top. And when President Trump made his understandable comments amid the campaign against Project 2025,
this was when he distanced himself from it.
That was a political consideration. It was also true to say that Trump is existing in his lane, which is to go win the presidency. We're existing in our lane. Legally, we have to keep those separate. So it's a totally true comment. And it's also true for us to acknowledge that great people will rise to the top. Russ is the greatest living conservative expert on the Office of Management and Budget. Not only did he write that chapter in Mandate for Leadership, he also served in that capacity in the last Trump term. And so if there's anyone who understands how you legally, appropriately, and aggressively use the Office of Management and Budget to do the will of the American people rather than the will of Washington elites, it's Russ Vought.
A lot maybe of the Project 2025 agenda may now actually happen no matter what the candidate, as then was saying. Is that fair?
It is fair, and there's no doubt that that will happen. I don't mean that with any disrespect to President Trump, whom he knows, who is a friend, but just to say there is so much overlap between President Trump's official campaign platform, Agenda 47, and the policies in Project 2025. That's what I mean when I said that it's sort of boring in one sense, because it's not newsworthy that the Republican candidate for president would be saying many, if not most, of the same things that the conservative movement itself would be saying.
Well, it's definitely not boring, I would say. Having spent a lot of time, I can't say I've read every page of the original manifesto, but I have read every page of your subsequent book, which I think captures the same spirit and let's call it strength of ambition that kind of communicated. I think thematically, the thing that is most interesting, that will be most striking to people, is just the kind of ambition when it comes to clearing out the institutions. Because most traditional conservatives, I think you sometimes call them waxwork doll conservatives, love institutions. There's a portrait of Roger Scruton, the famous British conservative philosopher, next to Karl Marx, as it happens, on our staircase when you came up here. You know, he will talk for pages about the beauty of institutions, how the little platoons that Edmund Burke used to talk about, and there's a sort of intuitive fear about burning down institutions. And yet in this book that you've written, you use burning down an awful lot. That's the metaphor you go to, actually. Literally, you then say figuratively or not literally, but you use the words burning down a lot. I think this is a quote, "What is stopping us from burning down rotten institutions?" Another time, "It's time for a conservatism of fire, to burn it down and steward once again the natural order of the world." So frame that for us. How is it conservative to want to burn down institutions?
Fair question. Actually, I am as much of an institutionalist as Scruton or Burke or Kirk. My point is, in the 21st century, that DC establishment conservatives, whom I call members of the Uniparty, have allowed our institutions to be co-opted by the left and have been cowardly in their lack of attempts to defend those institutions. And I could probably bore you with the detail there, but broad categories of examples would be most American public schools, in spite of the fact that I myself only attended public schools. I'm a fifth-generation teacher, and there are great men and women who are public school teachers, nothing against them or the schools per se, as much as using the metaphor of a controlled burn about regenerating those institutions means that I love institutions so much that I find it abhorrent that people who call themselves conservatives could look at American public schools or Ivy League institutions or the den of liars who write for the New York Times and say that somehow that's conservative. I think that's absurd on its face. And so I am calling for a much more proactive, populist conservatism that says we so much care about our institutions that just as our forestry service in the United States uses controlled burns to burn out the dead wood and regenerate the healthy trees, metaphorically, we need that kind of regeneration in most of our American institutions.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for coming and for kind of dusting off something that you've been so out ahead of this conversation for years in terms of having written about it extensively and so on. So I'm wondering, Carolyn, if you would just would you start us out with what got your attention about this Christian nationalist movement that significantly enough to really rattle you and evidently bring your attention more fully and write a book about it? I'm curious, what got your attention?
Yeah. So I was very aware back in 1980 when Ronald Reagan took office and, dragged along behind him some of these Christian nationalists, although they weren't calling themselves that at that point, and nobody else was either. He was friends with Jerry Falwell, and Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, which was kind of the beginning of this in recent times. Falwell's, design was to make all these changes in the culture that he thought should be made according to his interpretation of the Bible. Um, and, there's big hoo-ha around the LGBTQ community, of which I was a member and still am a member, a lifelong member, by the way. And Falwell really, kind of worked his way into Reagan's thinking and Reagan's psyche. But nobody really thought that the influence of Christian nationalism would become what it is today. It's kind of like, well, once Reagan's out of office, we won't have this anymore. And we didn't in a big way for a while. And then, we had Jimmy Carter, who was a real Christian, who really applied the teachings of Jesus and lived them in his life, as well as tried to implement them in his governance. And then we had the administration of George W. Bush, who kind of claimed to be a born-again Christian. And we had some folks in his administration that we could call today Christian nationalists, but they weren't they didn't have the permission to advance their ideology in the way that we now have it under Trump. So, it was like once Trump was in office, it's like, oh, these guys are back. And they're back in a different way. They're back in a bigger way than they ever were under Reagan or under Bush. They're really here. And, Trump is really sucking up to them. And then as I begin to look a little more deeply into Trump's own words about Hitler and fascism, and I begin to see the fascist structure shaping up in his administration, particularly after he was out of office. And we began to see, when he was defeated by Biden in 2021, and we saw the Capitol insurrection, then we really began to see the Christian nationalists coming up front and coming forward with their ideology. And it was like, wow, this is really serious. These guys are really getting a grip. And so I felt compelled, whether or not he was going to be the next president, I felt compelled in 2022, I think it was, to write my book, Confronting Christofascism, Healing the Evangelical Wound. And so in there, I tried to give some background, not as extensive as some other people have given, like Tim Alberta, who I think you should have on your show at some point, and discuss his book, which he wrote a couple years after my book, on Christian fundamentalism and Christian nationalism. Anyway, so I wrote my book, and I wanted to give a little background in there about the history of this. So I talked in my book about how it was around 1919, the early 1920s, when there was a conference that was called by, I can't remember the guy's name, but a Christian nationalist for sure, called all these theologians and journalists and whatnot to New York, and they had this big convention about what the church needed, because in 1919 you had the end of World War I.
Mhm.
You had women getting the right to vote, and you had the nation kind of moving into this roaring 20s. It's just like, what the hell? Let's go get smashed. Women's hemlines went up, and there was just this kind of casual, playful after the war feeling. And so the fundamentalists, we're calling them Christian nationalists now, but they're actually the fundamentalist Christians, the evangelicals, were terrified by this. And they were really scared of the social changes that were taking place. You had the Scopes trial in 1925, the whole debate about teaching evolution in schools. And so the Christian fundamentalists they wanted to do a backlash. So after this conference, we see them pulling further away from traditional Christianity and calling the people that were holding on to traditional Christianity modernists, or somehow apostates who were not truly following the Bible. And what we see from that meeting in the 1920s in New York, that conference, we see the fundamentalists becoming more and more conservative, going farther and farther to the right. And all along their design, maybe they wouldn't publish it and speak of it openly, but all along their design was to infuse American society with their theology, to convert the values of the country to their values and how they see the world. And it was all about, first of all, converting the individual person to become a born-again Christian, to join a fundamentalist church,
Mhm.
and go out and proselytize and work for the transformation of society into the kind of society they wanted. And so, I wanted to go back when I wrote Christofascism, I wanted to go back and look at how this all came about.
Mhm.
And today it's really become a national movement with lots of money behind it, very well financed, very politically strategic. And we have a group now, which I mentioned in Confronting Christofascism, called the New Apostolic Reformation. And these are folks who, for years and years and years, have talked about the return of Jesus Christ, or what we hear today as the rapture. Jesus coming back. Now, why would Jesus come back? Well, he would come back, first of all, to take all of his people with him up to heaven. And then he would come back again after that and literally destroy the earth. So they have worked and worked and worked and worked for this for decades, to get a majority of people to buy into their theology and change the world into the kind of world they think people should live in. Well, that hasn't really worked. And
Carolyn, can I just chime in for just a second with a question for you?
sure.
I'm curious if this is a good place to just speak at any scale about the idea of accelerationism. In other words, if the rapture, this idea that those who are savable, those who qualify, will transcend and leave this world behind,
Uh-huh.
is is this a good spot to just mention that notion that is present at some scale for evangelicals as well, is the idea of, well, so if that's the good stuff that's coming eventually, let's make it happen sooner,
Yeah, exactly.
eventually.
Exactly. Yeah, right. And they didn't used to say that. When I was growing up in evangelicalism,
Mm,
they didn't used to say that. We got to work for this. We got to work for this.
mm.
And more recently, it's kind of like um, they just had it with Jesus messing around, like he's taken too fucking long,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and it's kind of like, okay, we're going to speed this thing up.
Hmm.
And that is why you see their statement for the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a large fundamentalist group, really outlining how they want society to be. And all you have to do is Google New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, and you will see there, I can't remember how many points it is, but the ways in which they want to change society to be the society that they think we should be.
Right.
Um, and so, when you really look at what they are proposing, it's very scary.
Yeah,
And all of it is echoed in Project 2025,
yeah.
which
So
was
it's,
written by, the cohorts of Kevin Roberts.
yeah. Is is it fair to say that we can jump from where you were giving us substantial detail, let's say we've gotten to somewhere in the vicinity of the 20s, 30s ish.
Mhm,
And I know that there's some amount of relevant history, but it seems like there's some sort of threshold that they crossed into more visibility,
mhm,
more influence, more of a substantial plan, which you and I were just talking before starting to record.
mhm,
Um, every time I've heard of this, whether it's reading your book or any sort of historical context for this conversation, there's a way in which this movement gets a game plan and it goes into place, like the cornerstones are placed somewhere in the vicinity of the 80s.
yes,
That's
yes.
why I'm going to be peppering in this occasional commentary from Frank Schaeffer, the son of who is then a very substantial figure in the evangelical movement, his father, Francis Schaeffer. And so I'm curious, is it too early to jump ahead to those 80s, putting those things in place?
That's perfect. I consider Frank Schaeffer my spiritual brother. It's like we were raised in the same family or something. Yeah, and so every time I see him on TV, I just go, "Oh, my bro," I just really love him, and he interviewed me on my book as well, and I interviewed him. And I would say that definitely in the Reagan administration, when Reagan was so palsy-walsy with Falwell, Frank Schaeffer's father, saw an opportunity. And so Francis Schaeffer, his father, and Frank traveled all over the country and the world, really promoting this Christian nationalism. And Frank has a lot of regret and remorse about that because later on he woke up to reality and realized what he had done. Um, but I would say, that was the beginning of crossing the threshold.
Mhm.
And then, and it kind of went to sleep for a while, a little bit of rustling in the Bush administration, but then came back full bore with Trump.
Mhm.
But they certainly laid a huge groundwork in the 80s.
Plant a seed for including another couple of aspects, evidently, of their long game plan. If we could say that that's the name of, that those early days and those roots of this long game being planted. And so one of them appeared to be the the creation of and continuing to um, empower, design, fund at a massive level think tanks that could then directly funnel policy motion and also money to influence politics in the background. And in addition to that, which I'll be including a couple of pieces from Kevin Roberts, again, the person who's kind of the point person on creation of the Project 2025 900-page Republican manifesto for this administration. And that is to create, to populate people who are in direct alignment with their philosophy, with their all of their core motivations at every level of government, all the way down to the most local possible, and also at every level of the judiciary,
Right.
all the way down to the most local. And just to just to slow it down to bring it closer to what's in my gut about this, um, I can think of nothing more terrifying. I mean, this is so complete. I'm jumping ahead in the conversation just for a moment. We both made comments before we got going on this recording that they've got it all. They've got every layer going on as we transition into this presidential
Mhm.
administration and that who's staffing that. And they've got the judiciary from the Supreme Court. Much of the judiciary is influenced in this way. And of course, the House and, virtually every major component of our government. And then the amount of alignment with the oligarchic control that we're seeing, in fascist style, being put in place as well, whether or not they directly line up with the every part of the Project 2025 narrative, those oligarchs are pouring billions into empowering this administration, with Project 2025 being explicitly included as the backbone of this administration. So I I don't think they've missed a trick. They've got them all lined up. They have completely, they've
They do.
got all the chips on the table.
They
It's,
do.
it's a bit mind-blowing. So thank you for letting me just kind
Sure.
of plant those seeds. And if any of them is particularly evocative for you, please just take it and run.
Well, I'm not remembering a key name here, but I want to suggest that everyone watching us right now watch The Family on Netflix, because this is, and it was made by a gentleman named Jeff Charlet, Sharlet. Jeff Charlet is a journalist, and he follows the whole Christian nationalist agenda and the players in that agenda very closely. He's written a
Mm,
number of books on it.
mm,
And just watching The Family will open your eyes about the ways in which they have gotten their tentacles in all branches of government and continue to do so. Some very sharp strategists behind this. And it will be very chilling to watch the family,
Yeah.
because you will say to yourself, my God, how did this happen? And
Mhm.
it happened right under our noses, nothing illegal. It was all perfectly legal and perfectly innocent.
Mhm. Okay, we're getting close to the end of part one of this two-part series on Christian nationalist presence in all aspects of the soon to be in place Trump presidential administration. Uh, we've just gotten our homework, if you will, between part one and part two. If you'll start to watch the Netflix series The Family, she's spoken about it enough. So if that lights your fire, please do so. I'm in the middle of it myself, so I'll be doing the homework as well. But before we finish up part one, I'd like to put a little bit more vivid historical context on this lead up to how the Trump administration part two is really the fulfillment of a very long game plan from the people who have now become called the Christian nationalist population, the extremely conservative, often um, Roman Catholic or evangelical. It seems as you've already heard Kevin Roberts speak about how the first thing they did to put together this game plan called Project 2025 was to gather together many, many different conservative groups, some of them intensely religious based and others not, and not just one flavor of religious participation. So it's quite a story formulating. And Carolyn has just given us a little bit of her take, her framing of some of that historical context, especially leading up from the 80s through to the Trump administration, which of course we'll be diving into in part two. With this piece, again, it's Frank Schaeffer, who is the son of one of the most prominent voices in those early formulating days of the 70s and 80s of the far religious right, the conservative right of um, mostly at that time, again, Roman Catholic and formulating, growing evangelical population as well. And the big, well-known evangelical preachers of the time as well. So we're going to hear just a few minutes of Frank Schaeffer's uh, rendition of some of those last historical context bricks being placed that led us to this place now. So I hope you enjoy his way of telling the story. He's certainly a straight talking guy. I like his style, and I especially like his ability to look back with some regret and with some clarity about what he would do differently now. And he is a different human being now. And somehow that's a place of faith for me. I'm not a person of faith. I have no religious background, except rather a contemptuous one view of most established religions. Um, I am somehow have an upwelling of faith in humanness when Frank Schaeffer speaks about his regrets about those early days and his now being astounded at what they were putting together and how far it's come. So he is a very special voice in this, a voice of deep experience. So I hope you'll enjoy this bit from Frank Schaeffer to finish up our part one of this two-part series on Christian nationalism. Thanks.
And I had a meeting with Archbishop Fulton Sheen of New York, who at that time had a very popular television program. And I remember meeting with the bishop 3 times in his apartment on Park Avenue, by the way, a very nicely appointed apartment, as bishops tend to have. And he told me, you and your dad, Francis, are like the cavalry coming over the hill to rescue our movement. And by our movement, he meant conservative Roman Catholics standing up for what they regard as the ancient tradition. No abortion, no contraceptives, no sex before marriage, anti-gay, no homosexual marriage, no tolerance of any deviance from the Roman Catholic vision of a theocratic state, right back into the Middle Ages, pre-Reformation, pre-Enlightenment, pre-science, superstition all the way down. Now, Fulton Sheen introduced me to some people from an outfit called the Knights of Columbus, some of who were members of an organization called Opus Dei. Now, by the time you get to Opus Dei, you are talking about the deep-seated, fascistic, intolerant wing of the Roman Catholic Church. Stuff that sounds like it's out of a novel, but it's for real. What are their roots in modern Europe? Modern Europe. Francisco fascists in Spain, Francisco fascists, as opposed to, say, German fascists, that followed in the footsteps of the dictatorship of Spain and Portugal, pushing back against what they regarded as modernism. And this organization was founded, it's a shadowy, secret organization, to help push forward a fascistic, Roman Catholic centralized agenda that would both crush freedom and democracy and at the same time give a place of precedence to so-called religious liberty, but just for one religion. Staunch Roman Catholic traditionalists in the line of Archbishop Lefebvre, Bill Buckley, Fulton Sheen. And so Opus Dei became this organization in Europe and in the United States of people in high places in government and other places that genuinely, and I know this sounds weird, in an age of conspiracy theories where there are very few conspiracies for real, but this actually was a conspiracy to put people in high places and to influence the democratic process and, if possible, someday take it over in the name of the church. Exactly the same program that the inquisitors of the Spanish Inquisition that were torturing Protestants and Jews and others would have been familiar with back in the day. No stretch at all. Now, back in the 1970s and 80s, there were a couple influential people like Richard John Newhouse, who started First Things magazine. He was a Lutheran pastor who converted to the Roman Catholic Church. Fast forward, much as J.D. Vance has converted. And why Richard converted, and I knew him pretty well. In fact, when he started First Things, he asked me to write a couple of articles for them, which I did, and I brought him some other authors. For instance, I brought him a lot of people who published with Regnery Gateway, which was the hard right fundamentalist version of Catholicism in those days, the kind of thing that produced eventually Amy Coney Barrett, who grew up reading books published by Regnery Gateway, etc. And I remember that his program was to also, quote, bring the church back. So they had two enemies. The modern Vatican, as they saw it, they wanted the Mass in Latin. They wanted everything kept the same. No women in the priesthood, not even girls serving at the altar, nothing. The priest facing the altar, not the people. All of those traditions reestablished, but they also had a right-wing project to not only save America from democracy, I just said that, save America from democracy and replace it with theocracy and what they regarded as the law of God. But their program went a step further, and that was that they should undermine and overthrow the government as it existed. And why did all these threads come together? Because my dad wrote a book called A Christian Manifesto that sold 1 million copies. And the mainstream press paid no attention to it because back pre-Trump, they could care less about all those people in the middle, the unwashed mob who believed in literal Jesus and all this stuff, paid no attention. But it sowed the seeds of a movement which eventually became the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society that came out of what Lefebvre was doing, Bill Buckley, Fulton Sheen, Newhouse, me, my dad, and others. Fast forward to the present, Project 2025. You thought I'd never get to that. Where does Project 2025 come from? It comes from this background. Who did the leaders of Project 2025 work with, and what association do they belong to? Opus Dei. What is the mission of Opus Dei today? The same thing it was in Francisco Fascist Spain in the 1930s and 40s. What is their vision for America? Well, it was laid out in a book called Unhumans, in which liberals and evangelicals who don't toe the line on the hard right, say evangelicals who don't vote for Trump, and everyone except conservative Roman Catholics and evangelicals tuned in to having heroes like Lefebvre, if they've read enough, or Fulton Sheen, or Newhouse, and for more modern versions of these people, Opus Dei, who have put in place people like Amy Coney Barrett, who basically, her kind were groomed for 50 years by the Federalist Society, people I knew back in the 70s and 80s who started these organizations, Heritage Foundation, but they'd kind of given up on changing our culture. They'd given up on their program. They expected Hillary Clinton to be elected. They saw that we had a first Black president that went against everything they believed in. They were despairing. And then comes Trump.